Alright, so to simulate the guides, I like to figure out the guide simulation settings in a separate clean scene, just because it's a lot faster to visualize than having to try to simulate the guides in your regular first scene with all the first systems and everything. So I just have the geometry node with the line in it, and I'm going to blast away most of the body and just recreate a really rough mane. So I'm just going to blast away the parts of the body that won't have the mane on it. Just get rid of this mouth part here. And then I'm going to select this, add fur, press enter. I'm going to hide the fur since we're not too worried about that right now. And let's say that is our mane. And I'm just going to leave it like this, just because I'm just only testing. And I'm going to add a guide simulate node. And here, under the parent, we plug in the body, and then here the groom. And we can feed this new guide sim back into the hair generate. Now if I press play, you'll see the guides have just dropped down. So let me hide these ones. So it's simulating. But I want, oh wait, let me show you. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So I've just been using the vellum. You can change the solver to be a wire solver. You have options for sub-steps if you wanted to iterate more times per frame. We have, I usually just keep the pin to soft, and I really only change the bend and the stretch values. So if I bring this up to 10, because I don't want it to fall so close to the skin, you'll see it's keeping more of the shape, but now it's too stiff at the roots. So what we need to do is if I scale this by an attribute, you'll see it's created this bend stiffness, but then if I go into the guides, I don't have a bend stiffness point attribute. And so we need to create a bend stiffness point attribute that will read the length along the curve. So first, let's put in a resample node, and I'm going to change it to maximum segments. And note that the amount of segments that you have will affect how your groom looks when it's simulated. It tends to look better when there's less and less, meaning, 15 or less. It's not usually the best to have a ton of points in your guides unless it's really curly. Okay, so if in this resample node, I can output a curve U attribute, and this is reading the length of the curve, but now we need to turn this into a ramp and also have it as a bend stiffness attribute. So we can do that with an attribute VOP. Now, if I go inside, I want to bring in a bind, and I want to read the curve U attribute, and then I want to plug this into a ramp parameter. So plug this into input, and oops. I want this to be a spline ramp float, and I'm just going to invert this. I want the, oops. There. So that's root to tip. And then from there, I'm going to plug this into another bind. Bind, export. And in this, we're going to call it the bend stiffness. So now we're exporting this new bend stiffness attribute. And then if I go back into the groom and I click on this attribute VOP, we now have this ramp in here. And from here, I can, set the bend stiffness that I would like in the hair. Maybe something like that. And if I middle mouse click here, you see I have the bend stiffness attribute and the curve view attribute, which is what we want. Now, if I go back to the guide sim constraints, I'm scaling this by the bend stiffness. And now if I press play, you'll see it's keeping the shape along the roots, but now the tips of the hair is more free flowing, just more of what I want. And this is something you can keep playing the settings, but this is a general idea of how I would sim the hair for the walk cycle. But with the run, the animation is running in place, but I want it to look like he's running super fast. And I can add wind in the forces here. So now there's wind, but it's going to look weird because he's jumping up and down and, there's no noise. So if I wanted to add noise in this wind here, the way to do that is you need to right click on the guide sim node and allow editing of contents. Now we can jump inside and start editing these nodes. And on the left here, you see we have the wire solver, and on the right, we have the vellum. So I want to look for, I just press Control F to find the node that I'm looking for, because I'm really bad at searching nodes based on names. If you haven't noticed already. So this is the node that I want, the vellum sim. So I can now select and close, and it's found it for me. If I double click into this node here, you'll see we have the pop wind, and this is where I can start adding some noise. So just by bringing up the amplitude, should I bring it more? Amplitude, and let's bring down the swirl size and the pulse length. Bring up the amplitude even more. Okay, there we go. So now we can really see that the wind is blowing and there's noise, and I didn't have the wind quite this strong, but this is how you can create a sort of a windy look. And once you're happy with, and you figured out your guide sim settings that you want to use, you can copy this node and paste it back into your main scene, but just make sure that you're actually plugging not the groom, but the guide deform into the second input, because we need to deform the guides onto the animated mesh first, because that's what we want to simulate the hair off of, and then into the guide sim here. And don't forget, we also need to copy and paste that resample and that attribute VOP here to control the bend stiffness. And once you have it in the scene, it's probably going to be really slow, but you can cache it. So if you go to caching here, you can click save to disk, and this will save a BGO file per frame of the simulated guides, and then from there you can click load from disk. So that way it's not simulating every time you click render or you switch between the timeline. It should load a bit faster. And that's how I simulated the guides.